And new at 5, Warren County prosecutors do not think a judge should remove Brooke Richardson's gross abuse of a corpse conviction from her record. A jury convicted Richardson of abusing her newborn baby's corpse when she buried the body in her backyard. She and her lawyer asked a judge to seal her record. News Center 7's John Bedell has covered this case for years, including Richardson's trial. He has new details on the court filings.
When we reported last month that Brooke Richardson was asking a Warren County judge to remove this conviction from her record, Warren County prosecutors told us any comment they would have would be in a responding court filing. Well, now we've got a hold of that document and we can tell you what they have to say about it. The criminal case against Brooke Richardson gained national attention. But if a judge approves the request in this court filing, as far as the court is concerned, it would be as if the case never happened. The conviction would be scrubbed from Richardson's record, and the court documents tied to the case would no longer be public. In 2017, Richardson was an 18-year-old senior in high school. She gave birth in secret at her home, then buried her newborn daughter's body in the backyard of her family's house in Carlisle. What happened between the birth and burial was at the center of arguments in court. Prosecutors argued Richardson's baby was born alive and that she murdered her daughter. The defense said the baby was stillborn. In 2019, a jury acquitted Richardson on the most serious charges she faced, including aggravated murder. She was only convicted of gross abuse of a corpse. The judge sentenced her to probation, which he later ended early. In a new court filing, Warren County prosecutors argue Richardson's record should not be sealed. They argue in part, but for law enforcement's discovery of the skeletal remains of a full-term baby girl from defendant's backyard, no one would even know this child ever existed. Rather, defendant intended to carry on with her life as if nothing occurred, with no consequences or accountability for her treatment of the child's remains. Just last month, Richardson's lawyer filed this motion to seal her conviction, saying in part, there are no criminal proceedings currently pending against Ms. Richardson, and the interests of defendant in having the official record of this case sealed outweigh the legitimate needs, if any, of the state maintaining such records. In that new filing in response, prosecutors said the state is opposed to defendant's motion and this outcome because sealing the records and conviction of the case would diminish the seriousness of her offense of gross abuse of a corpse. The judge in this case has not made a decision on these motions, but there's a hearing set here at the Warren County Courthouse on September 27th. We'll be here and let you know what happens. In Lebanon, I'm John Bedell.